Hello, I'm Reverend Scott Wipperman, pastor here at First Presbyterian Church in Helena, Montana, and we welcome you to our worship service today. I'd like you to know that regardless of who you are or where you are in your journey of faith, you're welcome here at First Presbyterian Church. Our gospel reading comes from Mark chapter 7. The Pharisees and some teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of them disciples eating food with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they gave their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating food with their unclean hands?" And he replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are but rules taught by men. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men.'" And again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him. Rather, it is what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. For from within, out of men's hearts, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly, along with mispronunciations. All these evils come from inside and make the man unclean." The word of the Lord. So the disciples had come from the marketplace or someplace and were observed by the religious leaders of having not ceremonially washed their hands before they ate. Now the key word here is ceremonial. Soap was not in wide practice back then. They really didn't invent soap that we know it until about the 1400s. And the ceremonial washing was a mere sprinkling of water over their hands. This was true in the Jewish tradition, and many other places around the world had this kind of ceremonial type of cleaning. It really didn't do much in getting the dirt off of you. But the Pharisees were complaining to Jesus that his disciples weren't doing this, that they were eating with unclean hands. And to paraphrase Jesus, he replied to them that nothing that goes into your mouth makes you unclean. Now, many things people say that what Jesus talks about and says sometimes is confusing and is hard to understand, but I think this is plainly obvious because we all know that it's not what goes into your mouth that makes you unclean, it's what misses your mouth that makes you unclean, you know. Okay, Jesus didn't say it quite exactly like that. He did say that nothing outside a man can make him unclean by going into him, because the unclean stuff is what comes out of a man, not what goes in. And Jesus gives a long list of some examples of these sorts of unclean things that come from us. Evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. Folly? That doesn't really kind of seem to carry the same weight as many of those other things in that list here. So I had to go look up folly and see, what really folly meant here to see if it fit. And the dictionary tells me, it's not right up there with arrogance and murder, kind of thing. But folly does say the similes for folly are foolishness, foolhardishness, stupidity, idiocy, lunacy, madness, rashness, recklessness, imprudence, irresponsibility, thoughtlessness, and indiscretion. So, okay, maybe folly does fit in the list here of these other evils that come from us. But just because what comes out of you wasn't in that list, don't rest too assured. This was not a fully inclusive list of the evils that can come from men. There are other things too. So be careful there. But as Jesus is saying, it's these evils that are to be concerned with, not dirty fingers and ceremonial washings. That's not what we should be concerned about. Now, in the Epistle of James, we heard some other interesting things. Now, one, there's a question about who actually authored the book of James. So, one of those possibilities is that the author of James, choice A, is James, the son of Zebedee, sometimes called James the Less. He's one of the 12 disciples. B, James, the son of Alphaeus, often called James the Just. He's also one of the 12 disciples. C is James, the brother of Christ. And D is Paul. Don't choose D, okay? The book is called James, okay? You got that? But there's an argument as to who one of these first three might have written it. James, the son of Zebedee, was martyred in 44 AD. So the argument is there wasn't much time for him to have put together the letters that he wrote. So he is quite often not viewed as the likely author of the book of James. James the Just was martyred in 62 AD, and so there might have been more time for him to bring out a book, but he gets very little mention in the gospel, only a few places. We know very little about James the Just. And so many people think that it's unlikely that he would have been the one that wrote these letters. So many people seem to settle in on answer C, which I'm told if you take a multiple choice test and you don't know the answer, always guess C, because it's most often the right answer. But many people lean towards that James here is the brother of Christ, who was visited by Christ after his resurrection, and who became the first of the 70 as anointed by Paul, and may have worked in this, may have been the author of this. But regardless of who is the author of the James, here, what they're writing about today is several things. He first starts speaking about anger. And that if you let anger rule your life, then your religion is a deception. You're deceiving yourself that you're religious. If you let anger rule your life, your religion is worthless. Because as we were told by Paul, anger quite often does lead to sin. And then he goes on to say about what your religion should look like if it's free of anger. Religion that our God Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Now it's this second condition, to keep oneself from being polluted by the world, that sets what he says here in a little opposition to what Jesus said, that there's nothing that enters you can make you unclean. Because pollution, as pollution works in our world, as pollution is put onto land or into waterways or into the air, it takes what is clean, what is pure, and makes it unclean, impure. And this would seem to line up with what James is talking about, of not letting this pollution get into us. Now, our text says the word pollution, and actually James didn't say pollution. More literally, he said that, that you should not let this stuff come into you that would bring, you should be without spot in your inner being, is more of what he's saying here. Without spot, to keep oneself from the world is the literal translation of what he says, but we say it pollution or maybe defiling ourselves. So here he is saying, don't let pollution in, don't let it spoil the purity of what's inside you. But Christ is saying that nothing that comes from what's outside is unclean. So we've got James, fully human. We got Christ, fully human. Oh, but Christ is also what? Fully divine. So maybe Christ wins this one, huh? Because he's got more on the scale than that. So, amen, and we'll see you all next Sunday. I don't think it works quite that easily. So what is this? How do we put these two things together? That nothing from external can make you unclean, but to guard against the pollution of this world that might come into you. You may have seen a bumper sticker that was popular 5 years ago on some car someplace, and it said, "No one's born a bigot." And clearly what this bumper sticker is implying is that we are born pure. We are born bigotry-free. And that somehow, as we live, we learn about bigotry. And bigotry comes into us. Because we didn't start out as a bigot. It had to come into us somewhere along the way. Which would seem to line up with what James was saying about not letting the world pollute us. That we were pure, and somehow this pollution got into us and changed us. We had some friends whose daughter was getting married. And we'll call her Joan. And her fiancé, Sam, was a law student. She was a senior in college. He was in law school. And we met Sam, and he was a very nice gentleman. He seemed to have lots of drive and self-motivation because he was doing very well in law school. He was very personable and could interrelate with people easily. He seemed to treat Joan very kindly and nicely, from what we could tell. And he was articulate and seemed to say in our discussions that his interest in law was to go out and serve others, not that his interest in law was that he could make a lot of money doing it. And then the wedding day came, and Sam's parents lived in East Texas. We were in Austin, Texas at the time, and we'd never seen any of the family members before. And on the night of the rehearsal dinner, we were introduced to Sam's family for the first time. You might remember that back around the turn of the century in East Texas, there was a black man that was dragged to death behind a pickup truck by 3 white men. This Sam's family could have been that connection. These people were extremely bigoted. His parents and his 2 siblings, and rather uncouth in many ways. And it was hard to imagine, how did Sam come out of this family? He was so different, but he was raised by them. He was raised right alongside his brothers and sisters, but he was completely different from his brothers and sisters. So what I suspect that maybe Jesus is saying is that Sam heard the same lines and lies that his brothers and sisters heard. But that Sam didn't make a home for them. They came into Sam. They came in through his ears. He saw their actions. But it was like Teflon inside him, and it didn't stick. He noticed that they were not truths. They were unclean things coming into him, and he had just let them go by. He didn't harbor them. He didn't make a place for them inside him. Because I think if we do make a place for them inside us, if we do grab onto those unclean things, then they become part of us. And eventually they're going to come out in some way in one of these unclean actions that Christ was talking about. And maybe frequently they're going to come out that way. But for some reason, they weren't that way with Sam. Like I say, Sam either recognized these things not as truths, not as reality, not as Christ's way, and just let them go by. Or maybe even if they did find a home in him, at some point in time, he recognized that these were not Christ's ways, that these was not something good, and he gave them an eviction notice. He brought in the bulldozer and just plowed the structure down and restored it to the pure soil that it had been before. So that maybe it's what we do with those things that we see and hear as to whether they become unclean or not. Do we make a place for them in ourselves, or do we let them go away? And so, let those unclean things pass by. Because Jesus' emphasis is on our actions and interactions. That's what he's talking about counts and matters. It doesn't really matter about what we do with our hands or how we wash our cups. You know, there was a very prescribed way in these ceremonial laws to clean your cup. You were supposed to wipe it clockwise. So it doesn't matter if you wipe your cup counterclockwise. You rabble-rouser, you. These are not the things that are important that Christ is saying. These are the laws of men. Because you notice what the people are objecting to when they're talking about Christ's disciples. They're saying they're not following the traditions of our elders. Now, granted, in our day, new and improved is the big slogan. Back in those times, tradition was the thing. And so that was a big matter. But Jesus was saying it's nothing. Forget those because they're the words of men. Follow the words of God and what God is teaching. That's what's important. That's what you need to worry about, what comes out of you. So, these rules that were brought up, these rules of men, were not rules of God. They were rules of evil, essentially, to divide, to separate the good from the bad, the ones who wipe their cup counterclockwise versus clockwise. They divided. If you look at the Old Testament and the difference between the New Testament, we have a lot of heretical folks in the past who said it was that there was a bad God in the Old Testament and a good, loving God in the New Testament. And, like I say, that's heretical. That's not the right way. But one of the differences that is true between the Old Testament is the message quite often in the Old Testament is about the Israel people holding themselves separate from the other people. To not adopt their ways and their gods and worshiping these false gods and the other things, that they were to keep themselves separate. But if you look at the message that Christ has in the New Testament, it's about bringing people together. It's about bringing people in. It's about knocking down the walls. It's about inclusion. So let's not have these rules of men that divide us one from another. Let's follow God's rules that pulls us all together out of love and care and concern for one another. Or as James put it, that to have a good religion is really quite simple. All we need to do is to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. That's all. Amen.